All right, I think people will continue to filter in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Great. As you likely know, I'm joined today by Patti Engel, who is the president and CEO of Engage Health, and we're going to talk about a piece of work that we've been doing together, applying a rare disease mindset to accelerate and de-risk precision medicine trials. A couple of quick FYIs, we're in Zoom. You'll see on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A or chat option. If you have questions as we go along, please feel free to just put anything in there. We're only going to go through slides for 15 or 20 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. Been working with Patti and her team for a couple of years now, and Patti's been in the rare disease space for 25 years or so, and has really been an innovator in a number of areas, but in particular, taking these really proactive approaches towards patient finding, identification, and trial recruitment in rare disease. So really excited to have this discussion today. Patti and I are going to trade off a little bit between a couple of slides, but then I've got a couple of questions as well that I've prepared for Patti at the end. So Patti, I'd love if you could just do a quick intro to yourself, and then we'll jump right into it.
Great, thanks Patrick, and thanks for having me. As Patrick mentioned, my name is Patti Engel, and I am the founder and CEO of Engage Health, and we are a health research firm. We do quite a lot of qualitative research, not only market research, but PRO studies. We do a lot of patient finding work, and more with the advent of precision medicine, we're doing trial enabling work, helping people get tested so they know their genetics and can be part of certain clinical trials.
Great. And I'm Patrick. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sano Genetics. My background's in large-scale rare disease genome sequencing studies, and I'm based here in the UK, but as you can probably tell from my accent, originally from the US. So thanks everybody for being with us. And for those of you who just joined, as I mentioned, feel free to use the Q&A chat across the bottom if you have any questions as we go along. Great. Patti, I'll turn it over to you to set the scene.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. And as we were getting to know each other, Patrick and I, through some various business dealings, more and more we're having clients come to us talking about precision medicine trials. And really, one of the most important things in a precision medicine trial is to understand that you need to not only just recruit patients with a certain disease, but you really have to recruit patients that are informed based on what their genetic situation is. So already we've got the risk or the challenge, if you will, that you've got a rare disease and there aren't very many people to recruit. But then even beyond that, you have a subset of that rare disease. So it's really important to think ahead on those issues. Okay? Patient identification is commonly flawed, right? People would love a magic bullet, but there really isn't one. There's lots of ways to look at it. Some people say, well, I'm going to look at the prevalence literature. Let's figure out how many people should there be. And then go ahead, Patrick, next. And I'll also look at the medical literature to see, who's published and who has patients. I'll find patients through social media. That's been popular. I'll purchase insurance data. That's another way that we can find patients for these trials. People ask medical experts. They do a lot of survey work and things like that. Oftentimes they'll partner with someone who has a registry or a study consortia or even advocacy groups. And some really don't do anything. They say, gosh, I'm going to start my trial and then we'll figure out how to fill it. And that's, unfortunately, we run into that too. All of these things work a little, but really the trick is figuring out what's going to work for a project, what's been done, what hasn't been done, and what's going to fit for the project. And especially in precision medicine trials, it's a little more complex. So, Patrick? I should share with you that when we started on this particular trial, what we did is we took a look at some of the literature in movement disorders. And because our project was one in movement disorders, what we found is in this specific movement disorder, there was some literature that suggested that it wasn't necessarily just one reason that people weren't being tested for their genetics. In this work, what the authors found, it was Ryan and colleagues, this publication, this was published in 2019, and they interviewed like something like 178 clinicians, right? And while I wasn't surprised with the first finding that people weren't tested because their insurance didn't cover it, it wasn't paid for, the next two reasons were interesting, I thought. That really the clinicians didn't order genetic testing because the result would not change their approach. Because the precision medicines weren't yet available, they weren't willing to do the testing. And then the other thing was that they were really worried about the implications of those test results to the patient, their family members, their children, et cetera. So that whole idea of what do I do from a counseling perspective? So what we did is we set up, we really set out from the outset to take a look at these challenges and put together a program that addressed them proactively. Okay.
Great. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the program that we put together and then hand it over to Patti to talk a little bit about the healthcare provider side. But looking at those aspects that Patti mentioned on the previous slide, what we wanted to try to do is reverse engineer the process and ask if we were to take an omni-channel approach, not just through healthcare providers, not just through patients, and have something that really has an active and human touch wrapped around the process. What would that look like? And there were a couple of key requirements, as Patti mentioned: counseling support. Who is there to talk to a patient or participant about their result if their doctor doesn't feel comfortable to do so? It has to be no cost if it's going to be accessible to everyone. We also took a decentralized approach, so not tying it to a specific site or set of sites, but really opening it very wide, as is obviously commonly used in the rare disease space. So talking a little bit about the left side of the graph here, we on the Sano side focused on direct-to-patient outreach via patient organizations, social media, and other kinds of digital and offline approaches. We built a custom program website, and our platform powered the consent, screening, and ultimately the genetic testing and reporting. And I think what's really important to factor in here is that this isn't an audience where you can really have a digital only approach. And Patti's going to talk a little bit about this, but it's really important to not just assume that for every patient, every disease, that they can navigate a website, having things like 800 numbers for hands-on support and ways to actually really reach out to people, and not just focus on the people who make it through the process successfully, but actually flip it around and ask who are the people who are dropping out at each various step, and how can we actually improve that. So Patti, maybe you can talk a little bit about the healthcare provider side of things and some of the concierge hands-on support.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. As Patrick mentioned, it was really important to get this out to patients. But what we didn't want to happen is a patient to talk to their doctor about it and they say, you don't need genetic testing. There's nothing yet available. We wanted people to really be in tune. So what we did is we did some significant outreach with healthcare providers, not only through non-personal means like just email promotion, but also through MSLs to let them know that the program was going on, and the fact that the program was really trial enabling. It wasn't just that we were doing this to find out people's genetic mutation, but we're trying to find out people's genetic mutation so they could be part of natural history studies and be part of interventional trials later on. And that really grabbed the interest of the physicians, okay? We, as Patrick mentioned, because this was a movement disorder that impacted not just young people, but also certainly older people, and sometimes they weren't as adept in using computers or going through electronic consents and things like that, they had the option to call an 800 number and have an MSL actually walk them through a verbal consent, ask some questions, go through a screening, get them signed up. And it really helped quite a lot. In some cases, those kinds of patients who were a little less computer savvy really liked the opportunity to have the MSL to work with and could later then come back and call them if they had questions. So that first part of the screen got them through and got a test kit ordered and sent to them. Once the patient basically was in the program and they got the test kit, they had the opportunity to simply spit in the tube and follow the instructions and send it back, or they could call the 800 number and have the MSL help them through that. And I was actually surprised how many people used that. It worked out very, very well, and helped ensure that we didn't have people spitting in tubes and sending kits back, and we didn't know who they connected with, right? So that was helpful. One of the other things that was important in this program is we do know that even though is that survey told us a lot of people didn't have genetic testing because it wasn't paid for, there were actually some patients who had it. And so what we did is we made sure that the protocol on this project allowed for patients who already knew their test results to be able to upload them if they simply wanted to do that. So if they said, gosh, I'd like to be involved in natural history studies or potential interventional trials later on, but I've had testing, I don't need free genetic testing, at least they could give us those results and be eligible then. And of course, once the genetic test results came back in, those were shared not only with the patient, but also their healthcare provider. And the patients who tested positive had the opportunity to go through the genetic counseling, which we've gotten very good feedback about. So.
Yes, and I think it's one of the questions that actually comes up really frequently from the healthcare providers as well, because they may not, many of them may not have been trained in interpreting genetic test results. And of course they can and often have resources internally, but being able to know that something like that is available, I think is an important aspect of it.
Patrick, I might add that, while I talked about the concierge services as helping the patients, they were also very helpful to the healthcare providers. So for example, in certain cases, a healthcare provider would say, I have 50 or 100 patients I want to test, send me 100 of these kits, right? And in those cases, the MSL had the opportunity to just ensure that nothing fell through the cracks. When we knew, for example, that those shipments would reach the healthcare provider's office, they called to make sure that someone knew they were there and they didn't end up in a sample closet. Or when they started actually utilizing the program, they worked with the site staff to ensure that they really knew how to hand out the kits and things like that. In a few cases, we had sites who said, I really want to get very involved, but I don't have space to have these kits. And in those cases, we developed for them a postcard program where they could simply send out a postcard and their patients could call an 800 number and have the kit sent right to the house. So we did a lot of different things to make this work for people. And ultimately, we have really good result from them.
Yeah, completely agree. A little bit about the testing itself. So we have an easy at-home, non-invasive saliva sample collection kit. It takes less than 10 minutes to complete. It's completely non-invasive. And as Patti mentioned, for people who are unable to use the computer to register their test, we've set up a number that people can call and register their test. This may not be a requirement in every disease area, but certainly in this one, it was really important to capture those people who we would have otherwise lost. And I think that's one of the big overarching themes of this, is that actually by some really targeted human interventions in a few parts of the process, you can actually really, really boost the results, where if you just took a few of these things away, actually the results would be really different. And we use an exome, what we call an exome plus approach. So this combines exome sequencing, which is deep sequencing of all the protein coding genes, with a genotyping array, which is about 1 million markers across the whole genome that allows you to do more sophisticated whole genome analysis on more common variation. The reason that we took this approach was twofold. First, we knew that the genes of interest would be covered by the exome approach. Plus, there'd be many tens of thousands of more genes covered by that approach that would essentially future-proof us. So data could be reanalyzed in the future. What we see in a lot of cases is people may be interested in a single gene today and then only test for that single gene. But then if next year or next week, the scientific team actually decides that there's another gene of interest that could be targeted by the same therapy or a new one, then you don't want to have to go back and recollect samples. So being able to take basically an in silico panel approach, where you sequence as much as you can and then only report or analyze on a small subset, is actually a lot more cost effective and de-risking than trying to do a single gene or a small panel. And really, it's been really successful so far. And this combination, as the cost of sequencing has come down, this combination has become really very cost effective to do at a pretty large scale for these kind of programs. So a little bit of an overview of some of the results and metrics to date. And there's one more slide after this where we'll summarize some of the key metrics, but we've seen through both channels, patient and healthcare provider, really significant uptake. So starting on the left-hand side, from direct to patient, more than 1.5 million people have interacted with the program in some way. 150,000 of those we estimate are people with interest in Parkinson's disease or Parkinson's disease themselves. And they've had more than 600 orders through the website, plus 10% of patients that have been helped hands-on by one of these medical science liaisons. And then across on the right-hand side, we've seen more than 180,000 emails that have gone out across patients, patient advocacy groups and healthcare providers in particular, with more than 1,600 outbound calls going out to these groups to raise awareness of this program. And Patti, I don't know if you want to add any further info to that, but really this active approach rather than a passive approach, I think has been such a critical one.
Absolutely. And, we work with a lot of clients who say, well, I've got a free genetic testing program going on. But the challenge that I think we have heard over and over again from clients is it is a situation where there's a free genetic testing program, but not many people know about it. And so I think by being very proactive, not only on the patient side with social media, but also on the healthcare provider side, it's been very, very helpful because they ultimately are, I always think it's hard to share results because they're just a point in time. Right now, as we see the healthcare providers getting involved, we see a number of them started working on this, and that will increase as they get real comfortable. So the numbers today, really we project a much even greater participation than we're seeing today based on what they have for patients to go through and get tested. So.
And in terms of some high-level stats, the program launched last summer, and so far, from our perspective, it's been really successful, and quite a few lessons and learnings that Patti's going to recap on the next slide. But from a high level, the hit rate, so to speak, the number of patients identified with the rare genetic variant of interest has been about 8.6% across the program so far, compared to an expectation of a base rate prior to starting the program of less than 1.5%. And this has come from a variety of factors, including, as Patti mentioned before, opening up the program to people with previous results, but also enriching who gets testing and the messaging that goes out. For many genetic subtypes of common disease and rare diseases, the disease is more common in people of particular ethnic backgrounds. And so making sure that it's really clear to people that may be at higher risk of carrying one of these genetic variants, that this is a program that's not just for anyone with the disease, but really it's very much for them. And also, of course, other indicators like having family history. And so we tailored the messaging and the outreach about the program, both to healthcare providers and to patients, to really zoom in on this fact that if you have this disease in your family, this is really something you should be considering and thinking about, because, of course, within that group, the chance of having a genetic driver is much higher than in the population at large. Anything to add to that, Patti? Or
I would just say that right now there are 291 kits that have been sequenced. Others are in the pipeline, right? And if this hit rate of 8.6% holds true, we will have identified sufficient patients to fully fill the natural history study that this client is planning to do before they ever, file the IRB with the IRB, right? So the concept here is by doing this, they will have patients fully already identified in order to enable not only that trial, but other investigational trials as they go forward, and which is an exciting proposition, right?
Yeah, and I think you touched on this earlier, but really I see this as solving one of those big the big chicken egg problem in the industry, which is testing's not happening until medicines are approved. But we know that trials struggle because there aren't enough patients who are known to have the genetic variant. So being able to break that cycle with a program like this, I think it's been very exciting.
Yeah, it has been. You know, in terms of lessons learned, I think there's a number of things. You know, the first, which maybe sounds trivial, but becomes very important, is that every patient population is different, right? You know, this particular population dealt with some older patients. Now, if not mean that because I'm older, I can't use a computer or something, but there were people who were just simply more comfortable talking through the process with an MSL, and we would have lost them, right? So it is important to really understand the audience and put in enough different approaches so that you can not have any fall between the cracks. The other thing is something that you just alluded to, Patrick, and that is that compared to more passive approaches, this use of concierge service really ensured greater participation. You know, again, if I have a test program that physicians don't know about, or I send test kits to an office and someone who's very well-meaning at the front desk puts them in a sample closet and no one knows they're there, they're not going to get used, right? So we, you know, by really being proactive and making sure that every step of the process worked, it really has worked well for this program. The other kind of key lesson, if you will, is the initial results from the program have really provided significant insights for engagement with patient advocacy groups. With this client, we didn't start with patient advocacy groups, really started with patients and healthcare providers. And as we learned more, and as we heard from patients and healthcare providers what they liked about this and how it was going, then we got the patient groups involved. There were a number of reasons for that, more strategic for the client than anything, but ultimately that ended up working quite well. So by the time the patient advocacy groups got involved, we had a little bit of test data under our belts, and they were a lot more comfortable with what they were talking about and what they were sharing with their membership as well. And I think the big takeaway for me is the fact that the results from this trial enabling program are being used, not only in the planning, but also in the implementation, site selection, and other things related to not only natural history studies, but other trials. So as we've had the physician groups, for example, who've gotten on board, who really wanted to participate in the program, we've identified patients there to the point where the client is now saying, well, they should be a trial site. And that's been very motivational for the healthcare providers, but also it's been interesting because it's helped identify some kind of decentralized locations for trials that might not always have been part of the mix in the past.
Yes, I think that last point is so important because as more groups start to work in the same disease, you have this really tragic problem where people are competing over patients at one site, and then there's patients somewhere else who aren't even able to get involved in the trial. And so I think what's so important about widening and building a decentralized or hybrid approach is that it solves both those problems, and it's really a win-win for everyone, that every patient who's eligible and interested can ultimately get on a trial, and you don't have this case of fierce competition at the well-known center while patients somewhere else aren't even getting the opportunity.
You know, the other thing that we didn't put down as a lesson learned, and I can't promise you it is yet a lesson learned, but I have a hunch later on we will say this. This client happens to be you know, they're a clinical stage company. They don't have a commercial group. They don't have pre-commercial even. They have no sales organization or anything like that. And the opportunity for them to engage with people in the community, with healthcare providers and others, where they actually know where patients are and they actually can have established relationships with people who will eventually be their customers, I believe is going to prove to be a very valuable takeaway from this at some point in their history as a company. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, thank you, Patti. Anybody in the audience who's interested in asking a question, please feel free to put them in the chat. I've got a couple that I mentioned before that I'd like to ask. So while you're doing that, I'll ask the first one. And really, actually, I think you started to answer that already, Patti, which is how, besides the trial enabling aspects and finding patients to ultimately enroll natural history studies and trials, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the healthcare provider education aspects, because it strikes me that there's probably a couple different classes of rare disease, really, where some genetic testing is the norm, right? And everyone already does it and they know it. But there are many others, actually more than I think people realize, where patients can go undiscovered and undiagnosed for many years or their whole life because the testing is not available.
Exactly. And I often think of kind of these patient finding things as actually a little more complex than that. You know, you have those kinds of diseases where people recognize them, they're easily recognizable: Fabry disease, Gaucher disease, polycystic kidney disease, you know, things like that, Parkinson's disease, that people know that they have Parkinson's, they're getting a diagnosis, and you can do patient finding fairly easily by simply asking the question, how many patients do you see with this disease? The challenge, I think, more than anything, comes in those more complex diseases. Things like Wolman disease, also known as LAL deficiency, or primary ciliary dyskinesia, you know, PCD. The challenge in some of those, Farber disease, for example, people may actually see these patients, but they have no idea that the patient is in front of them. So if you were to go out and ask a question and say, how many patients do you have with Farber disease? They'd say none, because they don't know. What they really have, you don't really have a patient ID issue on your hands, you have a market development issue on your hands, which is an entirely different issue that takes entirely different tactics to figure out. And so here in our program, what we did is we knew that people certainly understood if they had Parkinson's patients, but we were not sure at various sites what kind of utilization they would have had with genetic testing. And it's been really interesting because there were physicians who said, I don't want to get involved until there's drugs available. That chicken and egg thing that you talked about, Patrick, right? But we did have a number of people who we were able to talk through, and because certain trials are so imminent, they were more willing to get involved, right? And so this, I think, was one of those benefits that come from having someone talk to you and not just say, such and such is on the horizon 5 years from now or 7 years from now, but to hear that in certain month of such and such year, this trial is going to be starting, it really got them off the dime to think about this and get involved. And I think that's been very helpful, and probably not something that a company without any customer-facing kinds of staff would have the opportunity to talk with people about. So,
what have been the major changes in the last 5 or 10 years? As I mentioned at the outset, you've been working in rare disease for 25 years, and a lot has changed. I'm curious what have been the big themes over the last 5 or 10 years that you've.
Yeah, to me, it really has to do with precision medicine. Even in I guess I should answer it this way. There's two things really that have changed. One is that this focus on precision medicine. We don't talk about breast cancer anymore. We talk about breast cancer with a BRCA mutation, right? Because people are thinking now in a mechanistic way. If we know what is the pathway, what is wrong, what's amiss with the gene, what's happening, and how can that be solved? If we know that individually by patient, we may have a better shot at having a positive outcome, right? So people are really interested in precision medicine. That's one change I've seen, which is really encouraging. And of course, we're all thrilled to see the cost of genetic testing go down so much with its increased utilization and things like that. So that's really exciting. The second thing I would say is something you alluded to, and that is the competitiveness of trials, right? I mean, today, years ago, patients with, for example, Fabry disease had no options. And when a trial for a certain technology came out, it wasn't that hard to fill trials. Well, now we have options, right? We have enzyme replacement therapies, we have chaperone therapies, we have gene therapies using AAV vectors, we have gene therapies using lentiviral vectors. And really, the decision is a lot harder than it used to be, right? If I go into an AAV trial and let's say for some reason the result is not robust and it does not, it's not maintained over a number of years, my chance of going in another gene therapy trial is probably not really good, right? And so I have to really understand technologies more than I used to. The responsibility is really on me as a patient now to understand what I should or shouldn't participate in. And I think we're seeing that kind of responsibility being taken on by patient associations as they educate people and by patients and families. They have a much higher degree of awareness and understanding, and that's so encouraging to see people kind of take charge of that and really understand that for their own choices.
Yeah, and the way that patients like us make decisions is very different than it was 10 or 15 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, right? Having patient advocacy groups that are really well organized online. I think for many people that can often be the first port of call, and you can bring more information to your doctor. And I think it's definitely put challenges, I think, forward towards the healthcare organization to really be up their game to some extent as these new technologies come along. The things that a neurologist or movement disorder specialist has to know about is just ever increasing, right? It's not it's not getting smaller, it's getting significantly larger.
Yeah.
We had a question through the chat, which is how easily can you initiate a registry with genetic testing for a rare disease without utilizing sites across the country, e.g. internet promotion, mailed testing kits? Are there compliance or IRB concerns? Maybe we could actually start with the end of that, Patti, when you look at the regulatory and ethical framework that these kind of programs sit in.
Absolutely. And basically, we didn't talk a lot about the regulatory aspect of this case study that we showed you today, but ultimately that is a single site study that was done through a central IRB. So technically, Engage Health and Sano are the site. We do the e-consent, the data are captured and held by us. And as physicians get involved, some have required local IRB approval, and simply we've been able to share the central IRB approval documents with them. Some have not even required that. So it is not difficult to do it that way. A little bit depends on who you want to also be involved. Our experience is that larger academic institutions, if any of their staff are going to offer something to a patient, that they need to run it through their IRB. But often with having our decision documents from the central IRB in hand, they've been able to take those and get a very truncated type of a review. So.
Yeah, and in terms of how the registry gets initiated and people actually get involved, I think it maybe is worth just talking through at a high level what the participant or patient journey looks like in a program like this. It essentially all can happen online and at home. It doesn't have to. It can also go through healthcare providers and sites, as Patti mentioned. It's a flexible model, but the most, I suppose, decentralized approach to this is that you've got a program website that describes all the information. You've got an e-consent platform and a way to screen to say this is for people who meet this particular set of criteria and live in the United States, for example. And then from there, the test kit is mailed to the participant's home. They complete it, it's mailed back, and then the results are returned both digitally and and through the postal service. The final thing to add is that for this particular program, and most of them, the healthcare providers are in the loop the whole time. So rather than it being purely direct to patient, where there's no healthcare provider at all, we ask patients to add their healthcare provider, and most are really very happy to do so, because this is an opportunity for them to take what is a research result, but actually bring that to their healthcare provider, if it wasn't the healthcare provider who signposted them in the first place, and have a really kind of educated and informed discussion with them about what that research report means, and then often motivate any clinical testing that might be needed. I hope that was helpful, and thanks for the question. We have a follow-up to that, which is most effective ways to drive traffic and interest and awareness to the website. It's a really good question. And I think the honest answer is there's a lot of channels that work, and none of them are the silver bullet. Patti, I'll let you add on this in a moment. The big ones and most important ones are partnerships with patient advocacy organizations, where there are patients who are interested in taking part in research and learning about this kind of program. Social media is really important. We've noticed actually a lot of really positive organic sharing on social media. So as many of you all will know, there's many informally organized groups on Facebook and other online platforms where the website can actually be just taken and shared by someone who's a part of that group, saying, "What do you all think about this? Is this is this something I should get involved with?" And those conversations are then happening in completely separate groups. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the healthcare angle, Patti, because there's quite a lot of nuance there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what we found, and again, based on some strategic considerations for this client, they didn't want to start for certain reasons with major Parkinson's movement disorder physician organizations because of some other things that they were in the midst of doing. However, with that said, we are just starting now to work with some of those groups. And ultimately, I think that's going to be a big way to make people aware of this as well. There's a lot of physicians out there who are in more rural communities or things like that, who may not see 100 Parkinson's patients, but they may see 5 or 10. And certainly those become important. So we're really hopeful that some of those will also be helpful. So anything else you'd add to that, Patrick?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Okay, very good.
What are the challenges that you anticipate if a sponsor is interested in rolling this type of testing outside the US? And a great question. It was one of the ones on my list as well. Interested in your thoughts on US first, global. How do you approach this?
Yeah, so we often, frankly, we do more than anything kind of what the client wants to do generally, which often is to start in the US and go forward. And actually that was helpful here because there were a few bugs we had to work out at the beginning, and that was a helpful thing. We're actually just in the midst of launching now in the UK. We'll be launching in the Netherlands and Israel and other places as well. So we're really excited about that. There are challenges though, right? All the normal challenges of doing a multinational study. You need to have everything in different languages. We need to have people who speak different languages. You have to have operational things at work in different places. Just shipping kits is different in different countries. So ultimately, a little bit depends on the country, a little bit depends on which aspect we're talking about, whether it be education or operations or whatever. But ultimately, the way I always look at it is it's kind of like an elephant, eating an elephant, they say, you eat it one bite at a time. And we really work down the list and just ensure that every aspect is going to work for that country. We've done other programs like this before. In some cases, there will be a few countries that you just won't be able to do it. We've looked at doing some of these in certain African countries that are very difficult just because of the logistic issues getting kits to people and getting them back and things like that. So there are some countries that are going to just ultimately be a lot harder than others. And, at some point clients have to say, is it worth, is it worth what it's going to take to get it done? So, but generally, when we're talking about the US, EU5, Canada, et cetera, Australia, these are very standard, traditional kind of programs that are quite doable.
Yep, I really don't have anything to add to that. I think you hit the nail on the head. It is it's a complex process. So there is no, like, I like the elephant analogy, but you've got a checklist of 100 things that some are the same, some are the different everywhere you go. Question about social media. I'm happy to take this one. How can you engage with patients on social media? Are you allowed to promote a study in informal community groups, for example, via a consultant? It's a really good question. Generally speaking, we do not go and promote the study directly within the informal groups. That's something that it's a sign that the program is resonating and that people are excited about it if they're sharing it organically. If you go into Reddit forums and things like that and self-promote, then people don't like it anyways. Really from the outset of the program, we build a laundry list of potential messages and awareness material into the pack that goes to the ethics board, so that they have an understanding of how are we going to be talking about this program, and really have that third-party oversight to say we're not going to be on Twitter saying get access to a new drug that's going to change, that's going to be game changing for you, because we're not it's not ethical to market programs like that. So we take a lot of care at the beginning to sit down, and we did this really together on this program to say, if we put out the virtual whiteboard and think about all the different ways we might want to talk about this and get the message out there, and build a multi-100-page document basically saying here's how we're going to go out there. And we don't always get it right in the beginning and can go back and make amendments and all of that, but there really is quite a creative process at the beginning where we have to think a couple steps ahead, and really build in the kind of messaging that we're going to do, because of course it's because of the requirements of making sure that we're doing absolutely everything ethically and by the book. We've got to do that to run these kind of programs. Anything to add to that, Patti?
No, I think you hit it.
Give people a couple more minutes if they want to ask any final questions. I had a little bit of a curveball for you, Patti, that I was interested in getting your thoughts on. There's been some discussion recently, and I think it's guidelines at this point from the FDA for improving diversity in clinical studies. So they've not set any firm requirements, but it seems like they're approaching it and getting closer to having some kind of requirements around having clinical trials and clinical research studies more generally be more representative of the population. I wanted to get your thoughts on this and what will change if, for example, the FDA starts to mandate that that these kind of programs need to be representative of the population that they're running, for example.
Yeah, and really it's a great question, Patrick, because ultimately, when we are looking, you mentioned it earlier, just in passing, that this certain genetic mutation of Parkinson's disease occurs more often in people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent and North African Berber descent. And we were able to do the work to figure out where those people had really settled in the United States. And we did targeting based on that, not only the social media targeting, but also the targeting to healthcare providers. And I think the same is true as we think about trial diversity, right? So, we need to be talking to healthcare providers in areas where those diverse populations exist. We've done a lot of ID work in the past with diverse populations, which take on an entirely different approach because of the trust issues with healthcare providers that exist with certain populations. And so we've done a lot in the past through churches, for example, certain religious organizations, certain school organizations, where the trust level is higher than it might be with a healthcare provider, right? And so I think that as we contemplate inclusion and diversity issues, we really have to think about those, as you said, Patrick, that whole big laundry list of materials that goes out to the IRB at the beginning, and include things there for some of those not so common ways we might share information, right? Is there an open, health fair, for example, after church on Sunday or at the synagogue or something like that? And we've done a lot of those kind of programs that have been very successful in helping to educate people within certain ethnic groups of trials and other educational content that's important to them.
Yeah, and a follow-up question through the chat of how logistically do you go about targeting these kind of groups and building those relationships and actually formalizing it?
Yeah, a few years back, I'll give you an example. We did something with a disease that impacted people of Persian Jewish descent. So really that was interesting. I have a huge database called Encompass. It's got about 1.4 million people in it, but I didn't have rabbis of Persian Jewish synagogues. And so I said, okay, it's time to go out and find out who those are. And we ended up doing that. And so that's really some old-fashioned secondary research, right? Finding lists of synagogues and finding those areas of the country where the Persians, located and things like that. And we went out and we put feet on the street to knock on doors and meet with rabbis at these different synagogues and understand if they had a life coordinator, lifestyle coordinator, sometimes they call it a health coordinator, that we could work with to get involved and things like that. And it worked very well. It was different. It was certainly not something we had done a lot of in the past, but I think we're going to see more and more of it. So first understanding the disease, understanding the population, if there's some kind of a founder effect or something, where those people are, and doing the outreach, the secondary research, and then the outreach is really what it's going to take, I think, to get people of those kinds of diverse backgrounds that would be important in these diseases. So.
Yes, and we've been involved in a number of these kind of programs, taking more community-based approaches and starting to see it more and more. I think as the size of studies and really the seriousness with which people are taking representativeness or diversity, that people are realizing that the couple things that we all think about when we think about recruitment or awareness, social media, healthcare providers, there's a lot of inequity between who interacts with healthcare providers, for example, in the US or UK, and that's going to ultimately impact your study. So I think it's a challenge to do it, to do it effectively, to do it at scale. But I've seen a lot of really great examples. There was a tweet the other day from East London Genes and Health, which is a genetic study here in the UK, and they do on the weekends, they'll go out to local mosques and just have a booth set up where they explain, what is the program, what's it about, and it's that human touch, give an opportunity to really explain what it is, and hopefully start the conversation. It's not like blood is being drawn on the street. It's a flyer, an opportunity to learn about what's next.
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear about programs like that, because the more those that happen, right, it won't be that we're the first time out knocking on someone's door and saying, we have a trial we want you to be in, I mean, I think that, the conversation is being started. It's encouraging to hear. And ultimately, by starting that conversation around genetics, it really ties into all the movement in precision medicine, which is really important to get appropriate therapies that are going to work for people of certain genetic backgrounds. So it's it's encouraging to hear.
And there was one question through the chat about whether there'd be recording, and yes, it will be available. I answered via text, but just to confirm in case it didn't come through. I think we've hit all the questions, and I just want to say thanks everyone who attended and put your questions through and listened. Very much appreciated. We'll follow up afterwards via email with a recap of the material. And Patti, I'd like to say thank you to you for your time and taking the opportunity to walk us through this great case study.
Great. Well, thank you all. Really appreciate the attendance. And Patrick, thank you for having me.
Anytime. All right. Well, have a good rest of the day and see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.